Hi and welcome to AXSChat. We're delighted today to have Rama Gheerawo, who is the director of the Helen Hamlyn Centre for Design, with us. I've known Rama for a number of years now and really enjoy talking with him about inclusive design. And I'm also a really big fan of the Helen Hamlyn Centre. So it's my birthday present to myself to actually have you on today, because this is one of my, the Helen Hamlyn Centre is absolutely one of my favourite places. So delighted to have you join us. So thank you, Rama. So can you tell us what it was that started you off getting into the world of inclusive design?
So I think when I was a student, I was looking at mechanical engineering, first degree, then design engineering, industrial design, the second degree at the Royal College of Art. And it was actually a fundamental question. You know, I love design. I wanted to be a designer since I was 14, actually, and marched into the Royal College of Art and asked, how do I become a car designer, vehicle designer? And I got slightly disillusioned with the world of design, the world of manufacturing, the world of commerce, the world of consumerism. Of course, I didn't frame it like that, but when I graduated from the college, I felt that design could do so much more.
Okay.
And part of it was, how does it affect people? You know, I think for my own career, I was always struck by something that I think one of the supermodels said is, you know, I don't get out of bed for less than $10,000 a day. And it got me thinking about what would I get out of bed for? And actually it came down to two simple little words, improving life. And it took me a very short time to realize that design was the vehicle for doing that. Design matters. Design is all around us. It's done by people, for people, because of people, with people, and people of all ages, all abilities, all needs. So that, in a nutshell, was when I found inclusive design, I found my spiritual home.
It's a great answer. And I think you probably found your spiritual home a bit earlier in life than I did. I had a slightly meandering path to get here through all kinds of different job types and so on. But yeah, absolutely, it's my spiritual home. It's a passion for me. I know when you've talked about inclusive design 3.0. So maybe you can take us through the evolution of your thinking of inclusive design to get to the point of 3.0, which is pretty much in line with Internet 3.0, I guess, now.
So when I took over as director of the Helen Hamlyn Centre for Design at the Royal College of Art last year, I build on the work of two previous directors and people who are giants in the field, you know, people who made real strides. And it really struck me that for the centre, there was Centre 1.0, Centre 2.0, Centre 3.0, and it really chimes with inclusive design 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0. So 1.0, I talk about being the era of Roger Coleman, who was the founding director of the centre, and in 1994 defined the term inclusive design in a paper to the Ergonomic Society in Toronto at their conference, where he talked about the need to design more inclusively. Now, there were two other terms that were around at the time, universal design and design for all. But inclusive design was subsequently defined by the UK government in 2000 as including the needs of the widest number of consumers, people, users. And I really love that definition because I don't think anything can be truly universal or truly for everyone. You know, maybe oxygen, but not even sunlight. So I think there was something about the need to define a European voice in this space. So Roger defined and discovered the term. The next director, Jeremy Meyerson, who was coincidentally the founder of Design Week, a journalist, a sort of activist background in terms of design, No one developed the term like Jeremy did. He took it from being a boutique practice and made it global, brought companies in, brought governments in. So there was a period of overlap where he and Roger were co-directors. So you can imagine, you know, that was a real golden era at the center in terms of growth. We were a social experiment. We were a social innovation. You know, did many people care about aging or disability or designing for, you know, supposedly marginalized groups who were actually the majority? We're finding out. But Jeremy and Roger really defined that. And Jeremy, when he took over as sole director, just developed that. So Inclusive Design 2.0 is about growth and development. 3.0, which I talk about being myself, is about impact and delivery. So we have this nice progression from discovery to development to delivery. So working with governments, working with business, delivering high-level projects, things like the London Taxi project that I'm leading here with Professor Dale Harrow, our Dean of Design. Things like working on an ambulance project, delivering things that are actually being produced in hospitals, looking at autism, you know, so the range of work that we do, it's all about delivery. I think one of the missions of the Helen Hamlyn Centre is to ensure that things don't just exist in theory, in theoretical practice. You know, every single person working for us is about making an active difference. So, you know, I often think that, you know, design may not save the world, but it will bring us close. And especially when you start to look at issues of varying abilities, you know, of disability and ability, this is where we need more impactful projects. And one of the mantras of this is that we don't just look at designing for disability, like functional disability. It's also about designing for people's remaining abilities and the existing abilities that people have. And this is a really sort of big realization for myself, for the center. So Inclusive Design 3.0 is about action. It's about working in a more social and global and digital space, but still working with those very, very powerful set of parameters established by the previous two directors. You know, the powerful motivation of designing for people with the widest number of needs, widest number of possibilities that you can. So it's a creative stance.
Thank you. That's a fantastic description. And I've witnessed some of your projects. I really like, one of the reasons I really like Helen Hamlyn Centre is because you have tangible stuff, the real projects that work with real people that you can actually see making a difference. It's not just stuff that's on paper. It's not just theory. I know Deborah's got a question, so I'm going to hand over to Deborah.
Sure.
Thank you, and happy birthday to Neil. We'll all have to sing happy birthday to him later. Oh, well, maybe not. But I was looking at your website, you know, and you're doing some really, really interesting work. And I was wondering if you could dig in a little bit into that work a little bit more, because I understand, you know, some of it, but what I'm wondering is, obviously you're looking at this from a built environment. You're looking at it from inclusiveness of all abilities. And I agree with what you said earlier, that, you know, doing it for the marginal societies, well, marginal people in society, well, you know, we're having that discussion right now in the United States about the 1%. So it's fascinating looking at this from the lens of the developed and the developing countries, since there's so much opportunity to do in all of them. But how are y'all tying in the internet, the ICT, the built barrier, pulling it all in? I was looking at just some of the projects that y'all have done. One of them, of course, that I thought looked cool was, well, a lot of them look cool, but the one where you're doing the building empathy one, where people are, you know, it looks like they're experiencing things with blindfolds on to sort of build empathy. But And along with that question, I also wonder, you know, often we talk about accessibility and universal design and usability and UX, and we start blending all of these words together, but it is really about how do we change the world by making sure that we're all included to the best of our abilities, understanding that our abilities shift and change, sometimes daily. Sometimes we get a cold, sometimes we get sick, sometimes we are aging. So how are you pulling all of that together and having these really powerful conversations that create social change? So I know I threw a lot at you, but I have a feeling you can handle
it. Especially on Neil's birthday.
That's right.
Well, I think I'd start off by saying that most of us are marginalized in some way. So actually the majority are marginalized. So when we talk about designing for marginalized populations, actually we're talking about designing for all of us, for most of us. You know, not all of us are able-bodied. There's lots of hidden disabilities. Even stress can be disabling.
Right.
Right. You know, the whole area of cognitive cognitive ability of neurodiversity is something that I think is completely understudied. In terms of the digital and the ICT, you know, it's a lot has been talked about this, but in terms of social design, in terms of design for varying abilities, it's upended the whole marketplace. You know, for the first time in human history, we have something that is not a tribal approach. By that I mean, you know, in a tribe, usually the elders, the more experienced people teach the younger people. And digital technology has upended that stratification of, you know, who holds the expertise. It also can be a great leveler and a great barrier, but a great leveler in terms of ability and disability. So I'll give an example. For instance, the digital reach that we have now, it doesn't actually depend so much on your physical abilities. So we've worked with lots of groups of people with visual impairment, kids with varying levels of ability who can feel very connected and very enabled digitally. That said, we want to make sure that the digital companies don't make the mistakes that bathroom manufacturers and, you know, kitchen manufacturers made previously. You know, we work across the spectrum here at the center, so we don't just work with the environment, we work with products. We don't just work with products, we work with services. When we think about what are we designing, we are designing an experience with product and service and environmental touch points. So I think we've worked with a lot of the major digital companies like Panasonic, Sony, BlackBerry, when they were, you know, still a sort of major player in the field, Samsung, Nokia, to really imagine how do people with varying abilities, different ages, different digital attitudes access their technology, and what are the future kind of provocations and perspectives that people need to have. And I think the results have been incredibly surprising. So again, in terms of this idea of social design, you know, social really talks to all of society, and in our digital projects especially, we've developed tools and techniques that allow us to key into people's particular needs. We have this term lead users. So we work with people with extreme needs in the digital space, and actually getting it right for them gets it right for everyone. You know, and actually, so that's why I go back to the point I made at the beginning, that sometimes we talk about the most marginalized, but actually we're all marginalized in some way, shape, or form. And I think it's important that we don't just deal with function, we deal with aspiration. And incredibly important in the digital space, is it just about getting people online? Or is it actually about enabling them to live, to connect, to have a better quality of life? When you think 18% of people in the UK cannot or will not access a computer. That's nearly 1 in 5. So with the digitization of government services, of public access, of consumerism, you know, you miss out on better deals, shopping, travel, holidays. Sometimes people are not disabled, so to speak, by the body or the ability, the physical abilities that they have. They're disabled by a kind of cognitive or an emotional or a social or even a geographical aspect of their lives.
I think that's
So
really
a large answer for a large question.
No, I think that's really important, and we do cover sort of issues around digital inclusion and this whole channel shift piece, moving all of the services online has potential to transform lives, but equally it has real peril of leaving behind the most vulnerable in society. So there's a real challenge to both government, service providers, and leaders in the field to try and make sure that people aren't left behind and excluded. So I know Antonio's got a question, so I'll hand over to Antonio.
Sure.
No, you made some good point. I was going to touch the fact that how important it is not to leave anyone behind, and even though looking to the current scenario, no, in Europe, in terms of what is being done in different countries, we clearly observe that there's a clear digital divide. If we go from the south of Europe to the north, and we see a lot of policies being driven by the EU, trying to create a more integrated society and a more digital society. But we also live in a society of consumers where there's a word that we are all came across, the term like digital natives. And I would like to hear from you, what is your position in relation to that? And because I feel that somehow that word puts a lot of pressure, and is not actually sometimes it gives the idea that it's something positive, but in the end is actually, it creates a lot of negative aspects behind it. So I would like to know what you think about the term and how dangerous sometimes that term can be, or if you agree with that.
Yeah. I think the term originated to help people orientate them that there were different kind of attitudes in the digital landscape. But I do tend to agree with what you say, that if you say to anyone, I'm a native, what are you? You know, I'm native to London, what does that make you? So how it's used, how it's applied by different people, I think the original research had a very pure sense of direction and function. But I think there's people who are digitally abandoned because of that, digitally ignored. Digital immigrant was the other term that went along with digital native. Well, are you a digital immigrant or are you a digital native? What are you? Where are you? And they are sort of loaded terms on the political landscape. Are you a native or are you an immigrant? It actually is something that it's a very rude question to ask people in polite society. So I think the really, really big thing here is that actually everyone is a digital immigrant, actually, to use that word. Everyone migrates into digital technology. It's just some people migrate quicker. So you'll see a 2-year-old start to pinch and zoom a book because they think the words on the page, the pages of the book should actually do something a bit more interactive. But they've just picked that up in a quicker way. What we found is that actually older people are not less likely to want to use the internet or want to use technology. They just need incentive, an entry point, and some sort of encouragement. So technology, this is a really important thing, that technology needs to bend to people, not the other way around. We shouldn't expect people to think about, I need to learn I need to learn a whole new coding, programming language, way of doing things. It's got to fit into their life. And that has been one of the big barriers. I think this whole idea of there's our customers that's a kind of us, and then there's them who are the rest, and the rest need to learn what we as a company are putting forward. So the digitization of the world, I think, is, brings a lot of positives, but there's a lot of barriers out there. And if we're not careful, we can soon, if we start classifying people in terms of their digital abilities, there is that category of the digitally abandoned, who, then what does life offer for them? I'm not saying that everyone should be connected all the time. I always say the most important button on my personal device is the off button, because life is textured, life is about choice, but the opportunity to connect digitally should be a part of that choice. The opportunity to switch it off should be a part of that choice. There's times when you just want to sit and look at a sunset, or read a book, or have a conversation. And there's times when you want to be digitally connected and have a conversation with 5 family members who are distributed across the globe. And that was a learning point for me. I used to be a bit grumpy about this. I would say, look at these people on the bus, they kind of got their heads in their phones. Well, actually, they're communicating. I didn't want to turn into my grumpy uncle who was saying that. People communicating in different ways. So I think it's about choice. It's about making technology fit for purpose rather than fitting people to your purpose, ultimately.
Great answer again. I just forgot to take myself off mute. Shows that even as someone that's digitally naturalized, I suppose if we somewhat, then I'm still failing. So we need to design things that are easy for people with very goldfish-like memories like myself to be able to deal with. And icons that disappear would be a great example. So for instance, we talked about cognitive before, and we talked about neurodiversity a little bit. You touched on it, and obviously I fall into that wide umbrella term, but I think it's really important that when we're talking about design, that we do design, and I've seen the work that you do, so we do design stuff to be obvious, to give people the affordances that they need to be able to take the actions and so on. So for instance, just then, the microphone mute button had disappeared because I hadn't moved my mouse for a few seconds. So I knew I needed to do something. I couldn't see where I needed to do it. So how do you deal with challenges like that, of balancing the need for simplicity with the requirement to make sure that stuff is obvious enough for users to be able to complete the tasks?
So I think it boils down to a very simple thing of choice. So there are a couple of things here. One is choice. I think inclusive design is actually about choice rather than simplifying to the extent of dumbing down. So offering people different choice, different access points, different engagement points becomes really, really, really important, especially in the digital sphere. I think we often say inclusive design is design with attitude. It's a social attitude, and that sort of brings me to the next point, that as well as choice, we often design just for an individual, whereas actually we need to learn about how do we design for a community, for a group.
Okay.
Most of us are social characters. Even if even if we're not extrovert, but you link and you connect. So when you're looking at that bandwidth of complexity and simplicity, I mean, what people want, the word I think that bridges them for me is clarity. That whether it's complex or it's simple, people want something that is clear. I mean, even in relationships, you know, people want a bit of clarity in human relationships, you know. On around your 7th date, where are you going? You know, what's this relationship doing? I'm sure there's a movie out there called The 7-Year Itch. You know, even 7 years in, what's the clarity? And I think it's like that, the relationship that we have with our products, our environment, our experiences, and our services. What is the absolute clarity of experience that you're giving me? And sometimes it gets lost, because if you take something like health is something where people need absolute clarity. But what does health actually mean? So to a doctor, it could mean about diagnosis. To a pharmacist, it's about prescription. To, you know, you, me, Neil, or Deborah, it may mean a glass of wine, playing with the dog. You know, photographing a flower, as I see you do a lot on Instagram, Neil. It may be traveling, as some of us do. It may be something that's so totally removed from this idea of medical health. So I think health is complex, but actually people's intentions, fears, aspirations are simple. We want some sense of clarity and purpose. So I think in inclusive design, if we can work with a passion but give people a purpose, I think that really hopefully talks to your question. You know, that whole thing of marrying the need to deal with complex human beings, complex systems. You know, you can't design 100 solutions for 100 people. But actually what you find is commonalities. And you give people the opportunity for learning, for positive behavior, for positive reactions, for positive feedback. And the thing that's often missing in design in the ability space is delight, wit, you know, a moment of delight, a little bit of mystery, a little bit of magic, a little bit of mischief. I think if that can come back in, if that can be present, sorry, I shouldn't say come back in, there are companies and people out there doing this, but if it can be present, you know, how fantastic is that? So you're not just designing for functional need, but you're designing a little bit of mischief. You know, I love to see that. Designing a little bit of surprise, a little bit of, you know, of something that's witty. Magic, I think, is the best way of describing it.
I think that's a great answer again. I agree with you, and I think that there's a little book written very recently by a friend of mine, Alan Moore, who's written some great stuff. But he's talked about the latest book, which is Do Design. I think it's called How Beauty is the Key to Everything. Touches on a lot of those themes, and I think that it's really important that we don't, with accessibility, with inclusive design in general, don't take all of the fun out of stuff. As accessibility people, there is a perception that we're the anti-fun police, that we're going to come along and take away like a vacuum cleaner and suck out all of the joy until all that's left is, you know, plain text web pages and all of this stuff. Well, no, that's not what it's all about. It's about giving people those kind of great experiences, but making sure that we include as many people in those experiences as possible. But you're right, there's got to be joy in this stuff. So I know Deborah's got another question. Deborah?
You touched on some of what I wanted to talk about, Neil, but it is interesting because we see a lot of times, especially looking at it from a U.S. lens, because I'm in Virginia, even though I do work globally, but we're talking about many of these issues from a compliance perspective. And I think I understand why we're talking about it from the compliance perspective, but I really think that we missed out on on not only, as you were saying, I like the way, the fun, but we miss out on really really changing society in a way so that everybody can participate. I think I'm now a woman of a certain age, and I'm watching my mom walk, being healthy her whole old, and I'm watching the sort of the world react to what's happening to her as well, and knowing that, that I'm hope to age and continue. I think looking at this from a compliance perspective, or we're all the accessibility police, sort of is what Neil was alluding to. I think that the more we can make this more fun and a real opportunity to support everybody. Go ahead.
Yeah, I love this conversation because it's we see it as an inclusive design, and at the center as a springboard for creativity. So far from locking you down for having to design for those, radically differently abled people, actually that's the springboard for creativity. Otherwise you're designing for kind of hypothetical people. You're normal or average are two words that I really dislike. Who's ever feels that they're normal or average? And the other thing is, we talk about people as users or consumers, but, users use, consumers consume, but people live. And that's what we need to get into. People don't wake up one day and they're 65 and suddenly they only like beige, white, gray, and black. That's my color palette. And suddenly all kind of desire for life has gone out the window. Or people who may have a disabling experience, which removes some of the functional ability, and suddenly they forget who they are. People are people, I think, is what I'm trying to say. And just looking at the kind of, if we're just designing for legislation or accessibility standards, these are important, but it can end up with the lowest common denominator approach to design, or the tick box. So, I once visited, I shouldn't really say where, but I visited a new building where they said, oh, you'll love this. It's everything has been designed according to, inclusive design principles. And I walked around the building, and of course, there were ramps, grab handles, and all sorts of, the accoutrements of accessibility in the right place. But I turned around and said, this isn't inclusive design to me. And they said, why not? I said, because it's a horrible place to be in. The building itself has no sense of quality in terms of the lighting, the materials, the finishes. So for me, this is an inclusive design. It doesn't bring joy. It doesn't attract you. And of course, just sticking a grab handle on the wall doesn't solve problems. I think they still had a separate entrance for people, people in a wheelchair or people with different abilities, and that to me with a new build is just pretty unforgivable. Yeah. So it's not just about the legislative; it's about the qualitative.
Yeah, that's great. I know Antonio's got a question. I think it'll have to be our last one, so that we keep the time.
No, going back to that, today, we have citizens, we have consumers, so we have, government who is supposed to design services for their own citizens, and there's a level of responsibility, and then we have a brand or an entity who are designing for their own consumers. What do you think, if we look to these two aspects of designing for a consumer or designing for a citizen, what do you think what are the things that we should look that are in common, and where are the differences, and what we need to take in consideration?
Do you mean the common and the differences between people themselves?
Yeah, when you have this approach to design, and you have citizens and you
Yeah.
have consumers. What different approaches you need to have for both of them, considering the differences that exist and the responsibilities from governments and then a responsibility from a brand.
Mm. I see. So the difference between a government and a brand and their attitudes. I mean, I think there's a couple of ways of looking at that. I've personally worked with a lot of a lot of people in the private sector, brands, SMEs, and the public sector, so governments. And what you very quickly realize is people are people. So actually humanity ties us all together. And it sounds like an obvious thing to say. I don't think we say it often enough. I often wake up and say that to myself in the mirror, that people are people. And even brands are led by people, governments are led by people, citizens are people, consumers are people. So I think that's at the heart of it. In terms of the subtle nuances, I think they're actually blending and blurring, because the public sector is becoming a little bit more like the private sector. Governments have to look at citizens, co-create with them, think of them in the consumer vein. And the corporate sector has to be more social, more global, more open, more accepting of things like social media, more understanding of issues of co-creation. So we're actually seeing a blending, I feel, of the two, which brings the idea of citizens and consumers close together. Because at the end of the day, what do people want as a citizen or as a consumer? Well, you want a pretty seamless experience. You want less frustration. Life feels increasingly busy, not less busy. So how do you feel supported? If you look at something like gov.uk, the government websites here in the UK, one of the things they said is, we want to give every citizen a delightful experience, which actually sounds to me like a marketing brief. It sounds like a refreshing soft drink. This was the government of the UK. So for me, my advice would be to not segment people so much according to what function they're fulfilling or what room of the house they're in. I'm a citizen because I'm doing my car tax, but now I'm a consumer because I'm buying a car. Actually, people want an experience. It comes back to designing an experience rather than designing a product or a service. So I think that would be my slightly cobbled together answer. It's a great question, by the way. I had to think about it. But seeing people is fundamental. Humanity is at the heart of design and at the heart of inclusive design and thinking inclusively. So let's go back to fundamentals. Let's realize that we are humans, and humans with not just functional need, but aspirational need, spiritual need, emotional need. And by spiritual need, I don't necessarily mean religious. I mean human spirit. We design for the human spirit. That's what inclusive design does. And it can make it or break it. So that's what design does.
Okay. That's a great way to end, actually. I'm cut. So thank you, Rama. I can't think of a better way to end our chat. So I've really had a great time. Looking forward to you joining us on Twitter tomorrow night. Let's hope you can bring in some of your colleagues who I know also tweet. The more the merrier.
Yeah.
Super duper. Thank you very much once again. And
thank you, Neil. Really, and Neil and Deborah as well, and Andrew. I think it's really good that to have this sort of platform. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.